When Dick Morey failed to appear at his wedding to Sue Crutchfield in 1861, his sister wrote, quote, "Dick's wedding day and he's not home. How entirely the condition of the country everything changes. 6 months ago, a gentleman who failed to keep such an engagement would have been forever disgraced. Now it's scarcely a matter of comment." Dick was unable to get leave until the following year and was finally married on July 17, 1862. But while it's true for men to have sometimes been disappearing, not so much always for women. But it does make me think of an anecdote, one that occurred before the Civil War, wherein there was a bride who got cold feet herself and ran away from her own wedding day. She moved to the next town, and upon doing so, fell in love with a second man. Now, this second man discovered what happened with his bride-to-be, how she had left another man jilted at the altar. And so, in order to at least ensure that this wedding went forward, when it came time for her to say her vows, he stopped the priest at the time of the ceremony, pulled out the marriage certificate, and pulled out a pistol, and told his soon-to-be wife to choose one. Needless to say, she chose the marriage certificate. Now, while we certainly think of wedding ceremonies, there of course are always the festivities and the parties of the time to consider. On September 15, 1863, was the happy occasion of the wedding of Miss Sally Ann Corbell of Chuckatuck, Virginia, to Major General George E. Pickett of Richmond. The residents of Petersburg still refer to the bells of St. Paul's as the Pickett chimes because they had remained silent until during the war when Pickett's wedding day had occurred. The wedding feast became a community effort. A gun salute was given, bells chimed, and bugles hailed as the couples embarked on a train from Petersburg to Richmond. In the capital, everyone pitched in to make the dinner memorable, including Verena Davis and Mrs. Robert E. Lee, who brought wartime fruitcake. Afterwards, there was a night of dancing. General Pickett's wedding was graced with the best the South could offer in 1863. Prior to the war, Americans sometimes followed the English style of serving white wedding cake, adopted for the wedding of Queen Victoria. There was a great deal of cake at Buckingham Palace in February 1840. Queen Victoria's wedding cake weighed 300 pounds and measured 9 feet across and 14 inches high and was adorned with roses. An ice sculpture of Britannia surrounded by Cupids caked the cake. Traditional white wedding cake, or bride's cake, did not appear in the United States until the 1860s. Prior to this, cakes served at weddings receptions were a dark and spicy concoction. A more refined cake was created with the introduction of finely ground white flour and the manufacture of baking powder and baking soda. The heavier fruit cake was relegated to being the groom's cake. In early Victorian times, there were usually 3 wedding cakes, 1 elaborate cake and 2 smaller ones for the bride and groom. The cake was cut and boxed and given to guests as they left. Traditionally, the wedding cake was a dark, rich fruit cake with ornate white frostings of scrolls, orange blossoms, etc. The bride and groom's cakes, however, were not as elaborate. Hers was white cake, his dark. Hers was cut into as many pieces as there were attendants, and often favors were baked inside for luck. Each charm had its own meaning. As for the groom's cake, according to superstition, any single woman at a wedding should go home with a slice of groom's cake and sleep with it under her pillow. That night, according to legend, she would dream of her future husband. Now, when we have our weddings, everyone is certainly enjoying the day. But once the day is over and the wedding night has gone through, next comes the honeymoon. And the custom of a newlywed couple going on a holiday together originated in early and 19th century Great Britain. Upper-class couples would take a bridal tour, sometimes accompanied by friends or family, to visit relatives who had not been able to attend the wedding. The best man preceded the couple to the train or steamer to look after their luggage. No one asked where the bride and groom were going. It was bad taste. Only the best man knew, and he was sworn to secrecy. Now, while we think of Civil War weddings, certainly the white population is very well known. But what about African Americans? They were around at the time, and they too would get married. But slave marriages were not recognized in the state codes. No state legislature ever considered encroaching upon a master's property rights by legalizing slave marriages. Marriage was, in the South, voluntary on the part of the slaves and permissive on that of the master. Slave marriages were regulated by whatever laws the owner saw fit to enforce. Some masters arbitrarily assigned husbands to women who had reached the breeding age. Originally, slaves picked their own mates, but were required to ask the master for permission to marry. Most owners refused to allow slaves to marry away from home. Men who married away from home were frequently absent and thus exposed to temptation. Having obtained the master's consent, the couple might begin living together without further formality, or their masters might pronounce vows. Ceremonies conducted by slave preachers or white clergymen were not uncommon even for field hands and were customary for the domestic servants. No slave marriage, however, was ever safe from the caprice of the master, who could end the marriage by selling one or both of the partners. Thus, a slave preacher in Kentucky united couples in wedlock until death or distance do you part. Now, some have heard of the phrase jumping the broom. Now, this is developed out of West Africa Ashanti custom. The broom in Ashanti culture held spiritual value and symbolized sweeping away past wrongs or warding off evil spirits. Brooms were waved over the heads of marrying couples to ward off spirits. The couple would often not always jump over the broom at the end of the ceremony. The custom took on additional significance in the context of slavery in the United States. Slaves had no right to legal marriage. Slaveholders considered slaves property and feared that legal marriage and family bonds had the potential to lead to organization and revolt. Marriage rituals, however, were important events to Africans, who came in many cases from the richly ceremonial African cultures. Taking marriage vows in the presence of a witness and then leaping over the handle of a broom became the common practice to create a recognized union. Brooms are also symbols of the hearth, the center of the new family being created. Now, while Queen Victoria has certainly been looked at so far, there are other famous figures, certainly of Great Britain, of the United States, of all over, that should be considered and looked at. For instance, let us take the Lee family. Now, although Robert E. Lee came from a prominent family at the time of his birth, there is no family fortune left. Lee graduated from West Point at the second of his class, but had only his meager Army pay and his person to offer a bride. He fell in love with Mary Custis, a wealthy heiress, who was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis. One afternoon, while taking a break from reading a novel by Sir Walter Scott, Lee proposed to Mary over a piece of fruitcake. Mary's father reluctantly agreed to the marriage. A grand wedding was held on June 30th, 1831. After the wedding, Mary insisted that they live on Lee's Army pay rather than in luxury. Mary bore Lee 7 children in 14 years. Another famous family in Virginia is that of the Stuart family. In 1855, J.E.B. Stuart met Flora Cook, the daughter of the commander of the 2nd U.S. Dragoon Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook. They became engaged in September, less than 2 months after meeting. Stuart humorously wrote of his rapid courtship in Latin, Veni, vidi, victis sum. I came, I saw, I was conquered. Very romantic. But one can't help but think of the Lincoln family, famous for the North. In autumn of 1863, Abraham Lincoln, then a 27-year-old Illinois representative studying law, enthusiastically agreed to marry Mary S. Owens, whom he had met 3 years earlier. But Lincoln had not seen Mary in 3 years, and upon her arrival found himself in a predicament. Mary was not nearly as beautiful as he remembered. In fact, as he explained to another friend, I knew she was oversized, but she now appeared a fair match for Falstaff. I knew she was called an old maid, and I felt no doubt of the truth of at least half of this. But now, when I beheld her, I could not for the life avoid thinking of my mother. And this, not from withered features, for her skin was too full of fat, but from her want of teeth, weather-beaten appearance in general, and from a kind of notion that ran in my head that nothing could have commenced at the size of infancy and reached her present bulk in less than 35 or 40 years.